Stand close enough to a Jackson Pollock canvas, specifically something like Autumn Rhythm, and you lose the edges of the world. You are consumed by a kinetic storm of black, white, and tan skeins that seem to possess no beginning and no end. It is not a picture of something, it is the physical residue of an event. You can almost hear the rhythmic slap of house paint hitting the unprimed canvas, the breath of the artist as he danced around the floor, flicking his wrist in a trance-like state of creation. It is visceral, messy, and unapologetically raw. To the traditionalists of the 1940s, this was anarchy. It was the destruction of form, a descent into madness where skill was replaced by accident. But look deeper. In those chaotic drips, there is a pulse, a frantic, undeniable assertion of the individual human spirit screaming its existence against the void. Now, contrast this violent energy with the silence of a Mark Rothko. Picture standing before one of his towering rectangles of floating color, hazy reds bleeding into deep violets. Where Pollock is a shout, Rothko is a whisper, but a whisper so profound it feels like a prayer. These works demand that you stop. They strip away narrative, history, and symbol, leaving you alone with pure emotion. This was the radical break of abstract expressionism. It rejected the idea that art should serve a clear social purpose or tell a tidy story. It was an art of the interior, a cartography of the psyche, exploring the terrified, jubilant, and tragic depths of the subconscious mind. But in the geopolitical climate of the mid-20th century, this aesthetic of chaos and silence was more than just a new way of seeing, it was a weapon waiting to be loaded. Across the ocean, behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union had mandated a very different artistic philosophy, Socialist Realism. In Moscow, art was a tool of the state, rigid and representational. Paintings depicted muscular factory workers, smiling peasants, and heroic leaders, all bathed in the golden light of a utopian future that didn't exist. There was no room for ambiguity in Soviet art, and certainly no room for the tortured soul of the individual. It was art as propaganda, clear and collective. This created a stark visual binary for the world stage. On one side, the suffocating conformity of the collective, on the other, the wild, untamed frontier of the individual. The United States government, specifically the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, recognized a golden opportunity in this contrast. They realized that the very things the American public mocked about modern art, its incomprehensibility, its elitism, its lack of clear meaning, were exactly what made it useful. If the Soviets were peddling conformity, America would peddle chaos. If the Soviets demanded obedience, America would celebrate rebellion. Abstract Expressionism, with its total lack of political dogma, became the perfect visual manifesto for American freedom. It was proof that in the West, the human mind was free to wander, to fail, to explode, and to dream without boundaries. The irony, of course, was that this freedom was being packaged and sold by the very spies whose job was to control the narrative. The chaos on the canvas was real, but the frame was being built by the state. The operation was a masterpiece of deception, perhaps the greatest conceptual art piece of the century, though no museum label will ever credit the artist, the Central Intelligence Agency. The strategy was known as the long leash. The architects of the Cold War understood a fundamental truth about culture. It cannot be forced, it must be cultivated. If the U.S. government had openly sponsored these radical, often drunken, and notoriously anti-establishment artists, the propaganda would have collapsed instantly. Pollock, de Kooning, Motherwell, these were not patriots in the traditional sense. Many had flirted with communism in the 1930s. They were anarchists, existentialists, and recluses who loathed the buttoned-up conformity of Washington. They would have sooner set their canvases on fire than paint for the man. So the CIA became the Invisible Patron. They established a front organization with a name so blandly bureaucratic it sounded harmless, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Headquartered in Paris, the CCF acted as a sophisticated laundry machine for government money. Millions of dollars were funneled through dummy foundations, the Farfield Foundation, the Kaplan Fund, to sponsor literary magazines, music festivals, and, most importantly, blockbuster art exhibitions. Shows like The New American Painting, which toured the great capitals of Europe, were secretly underwritten by American tax dollars. The curators, the gallery owners, and the critics were often witting or unwitting accomplices, swept up in the excitement of promoting this bold new American wave. Consider the role of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The board of trustees was a who's who of the Cold War elite. Nelson Rockefeller, whose mother co-founded the museum, referred to abstract art as free enterprise painting. These power brokers understood that exporting abstract expressionism was a way to colonize the European mind. When European intellectuals, who generally viewed America as a cultural wasteland of chewing gum and cowboy movies, walked into a gallery in Paris or Berlin and saw the monumental scale of a Clyfford Still or the intellectual rigor of a Robert Motherwell, their prejudices were shattered. Here was an art that was sophisticated, daring, and utterly modern. It made the Soviet realists look like antiquated illustrators stuck in the 19th century. The brilliance of the long leash policy was that the artists were kept entirely in the dark. Jackson Pollock died in a car crash in 1956, never knowing that his drip technique was being used to drip American ideology across the globe. The CIA didn't tell them what to paint. They didn't need to. The art itself was the message. By simply existing and by being championed on a global scale, these paintings screamed liberty. It was a paradox of the highest order. The government was secretly funding the very people who questioned authority, using their dissent as proof of the system's tolerance. The spies had weaponized the avant-garde, turning the erratic brushstrokes of the tortured artist into a shield against communism. It was soft power at its most elegant and insidious, a cultural coup d'etat that conquered hearts and minds without firing a single shot. The dust of the Cold War has long since settled, and the Berlin Wall is a memory. But the tectonic shift engineered by this operation remains the defining geography of the modern art world. Before the 1950s, Paris was the undisputed capital of culture. It was the city of Picasso, Matisse, and the Surrealists, the pilgrimage site for anyone who wanted to matter. But by the time the CIA's operation reached its zenith, the center of gravity had violently shifted. New York City was the new Rome. The New York School had not only arrived, it had conquered. This transfer of power was not merely a change of address. It was a philosophical victory that reshaped how we understand the purpose of art itself. The success of abstract expressionism established a new universal language. Because the art was abstract, it required no translation. A Rothko painting feels the same in Tokyo as it does in London. It bypassed the barriers of language and culture, speaking directly to the nervous system. This universality was the ultimate triumph of American cultural imperialism. It suggested that the American experience, the emphasis on the individual, the grand scale, the rejection of history, was actually the human experience. The CIA had helped to canonize a style that prioritized the subjective over the collective, effectively silencing the more socially conscious, political art forms that had thrived in the 1930s. Art was no longer about we, it was about I. However, we must ask ourselves a difficult question. Does this knowledge taint the art? When we stand before a Pollock today, seeing the intricate web of chaos he wove, is the experience diminished because we know it was paid for by a black budget? There is a cynicism in realizing that these masterpieces of human expression were used as pawns on a geopolitical chessboard. It suggests that even our wildest dreams of freedom can be co-opted by the machinery of power. Yet there is also a resilience in the work that transcends its secret patronage. the emotions captured in the paint, the angst, the joy, the sublime terror of existence are authentic. The spies may have bought the frame, but they could not fabricate the soul of the painting. Ultimately, the story of the CIA and abstract expressionism is a testament to the terrifying power of art. The government didn't fund these painters because they loved beauty, they funded them because they feared it. They understood that images shape reality, that a splash of paint could hold more weight than a manifesto. Today, as we walk through the hallowed halls of our modern museums, we are walking through the remnants of a battlefield. The paintings hang silent and majestic, victorious veterans of a war we didn't know was being fought. They remind us that art is never just decoration. It is always, inevitably, political. And in the end, perhaps the art outlived the lie. The Cold War is over, the spies are gone, but the paint is still wet with the possibility of freedom. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the canvas, consider subscribing to Echoes of Modern. We're building a community of thinkers who want to see beyond the frame. Join us next time as we continue to explore the philosophy behind the paint.